How you doing, guys? This is Eric from RuleTheWasteland.com, secretoftheinternet.com. I would like watching movies about shit-hit-the-fan scenarios, wilderness survival, stuff like that. All the typical movies that people have heard of and some that people haven't. And while I don't like the idea of coming up with crazy what-if scenarios and using that to justify all manner of ridiculous things you think you need to do, it can be useful to look at some of these movies and see what your preparations are, how they would have worked in these situations, assuming that they're realistic, and maybe also use it to come up with things that you might not have thought of before. And just using them generally as an exercise for figuring out things that maybe you wouldn't have thought of. And if nothing else, it's fun. It allows you to come up with maybe little holes in your preps, at least even maybe your mental preparations, certainly your physical preparations, and just using them as an exercise to see how things might work in these situations. So I plan on doing a kind of regular series, maybe not super regular, but recurring series while I will look at movies that feature, if not the whole movie, shit-hit-the-fan scenarios, maybe just certain segments of the movie or TV shows, and seeing what lessons can be learned or extrapolated from that, what kind of things they make us think of, and what kind of ideas they might conjure up or even disprove or prove based on what's happening in these movies. Now, like I said, I caution you against using movies or fictional media to be any sort of true indicator of real life, but they can still be a good starting point for getting your mind brainstorming on this stuff and thinking about it and seeing situations that you might not have thought of. So this movie that I've recently watched is called Trigger Effect, I believe, and it was a 1996 movie with Kyle MacLachlan and Elizabeth Shue about a suburban couple who is plunged into a very widespread electrical blackout. It's never talked in the movie about exactly what causes it, because that's not really the focus of the movie. The focus is about human interactions, human nature, and all the things that happen as a result of people being plunged into a localized but extremely serious shit-hit-the-fan scenario. And I like this one because it's not a super crazy end-of-the-world type situation. It's something that can absolutely happen in real life, has happened in real life, happens around the world all the time, and shows how not being prepared can have serious consequences, and how poor decision making, just not being prepared to make the correct decisions, letting your fears and stuff take hold, how that can be a bad thing, and even what would be a relatively minor shit-the-fan scenario. Now, there will be spoilers. I'm talking about specific things that happen throughout the course of this movie, so I recommend you guys go watch that movie first. It's on Netflix. I just watched it a few days ago. I'd never heard of it before, to be honest. And it was interesting. It was definitely, should be interesting. Kind of frustrating for people who are serious preppers and really into preparedness, because the characters repeatedly do things that are incredibly stupid. And I'll get into some of the more frustrating elements in a second, but I just want to know, go watch the movie, then come back and watch this video, because it will be talking about spoilers. Now, the first lesson of the movie is that, what I say every time I talk about this stuff, is that a basic 6-month preparedness kind of portfolio, if you want to call it that, will cover 99.5% of all the shit that happens out there, and this situation in this movie is no exception. There would have been no movie if they had even the basic preparations that I have, that probably many of you have. I've made it very clear that I'm not really structuring my life to prepare for Mad Max end of the world events. I'm doing basic 6 months of food and water and other things that I need to be able to do, basic precautions for security and things like that, just to be able to last through up to 6 months of not having resources available at the store. And I think that covers almost everything out there. And this situation is no different. If they were in the situation that I'm in, it would have been a 15-minute short film about turning on your lanterns, cracking open some food, and just waiting while the power took a week or whatever it took in this movie to come back on. So that's the first one. The second lesson that we can learn from this is that you need to have experience using your gear, your weapons, and things like that. One of the things that happens in this movie when they realize that the power outage is really widespread is people are starting to get antsy and nervous. They hear reports of looting and crime, so they decide that they need a gun, and the wife is like, oh, I thought we don't like guns and all this. So they have to go out in the midst of the blackout where there's no power and buy a gun from a gun store, and the guy has no idea how to use it or anything like that Another example that can be learned from this is to always have cash on hand. That came up repeatedly in this movie. It's something I've mentioned before. If power goes out, even in a minor way, nothing electronic, credit cards, debit cards, Apple Pay, Venmo, PayPal, none of that is going to be accessible. You have to have some cash. It doesn't have to be a huge economic crisis or anything like that, or a huge end of the world type scenario. Any sort of minor grid hiccup, cash is going to be king in the interim, and you might be able to actually get some really good deals on stuff if you have actual physical cash, and especially if you know this is not going to be a long-term scenario. You can get, because people will need cash, they might be willing to sell things that you do need, you'll be able to buy. So in the movie, he has to end up giving the guy a $600 watch, which he says he'll give him $300 worth of store credit for, and then he sells him a $95 shotgun for that $300, because this was in 1996, so you could get a decent shotgun for $100. So they end up paying $600 for a $100 gun. He doesn't know how to use it. The idiot wife ends up throwing the shotgun in the pool because she is against guns. She doesn't tell him. She ends up throwing it in the swimming pool, which I would get fucking divorced. Not that I would get married in the first place, but I might just move to Saudi Arabia just to get married and slap the woman if she ever did something that retarded. And that would be inexcusable if any of my belongings, let alone any of my guns, ended up in a swimming pool during a minor shit hit the fan scenario. So that leads me on to my next point, which is being with people that are not on board with either your just general value systems and certainly your security plan and value systems there. That can be a huge, huge liability. And it basically ended up almost costing them their life at certain points in the movie, because they did fish it out, and half the ammo was not working, which is probably a very likely scenario. Shotgun shells are not perfectly waterproof in the way that some other cartridges might be. You know, they're just crimped plastic. They could certainly get destroyed by dumping it all in the water. So extra retarded. Another lesson is they bought the gun, they go to sleep or whatever, they don't even have the gun with them. It was in like the living room, and someone breaks into their house to loot them, or just to rob their house. Someone who is doing maintenance on the house comes back during the power outage and decides to burgle them. And they don't even have the shotgun with them in the bedroom when they're going to sleep. That's an inexcusable oversight, and certainly could cost you your life. There's no point to even having the gun if you don't have it accessible during these specific times. And that doesn't mean every night if you don't think there's any risk, which I think you should still have it accessible, especially if you don't have kids or anything like that. You might as well have it within arm's reach, at least in some sort of configuration where, even if it's locked up, something where you can get at it. Certainly in a situation of heightened alertness and heightened danger, there's no excuse for not having that in the same room as you. So that was a disaster. Another element is they had no other home security. Certainly if you had a dog, which you don't have to get a dog, but they're great for home security. No one would be getting into your house without you knowing about it. In fact, many people, just by knowing you have a dog, even if they're not afraid of it, just knowing it's going to bark and wake you up, they're not even going to try for anything that's not super serious. And even if they are trying, you get at least a little bit of notice. And certainly if you have a dog that's big and scary and capable and willing to attack the people, that's going to be a whole nother level of deterrent. And even if it's not a deterrent, a whole nother level of security, because the person will get tore up. Now, the biggest element of this movie, to me, that was a gigantic mistake, and also for the characters in the movie, and even further highlighted the need to just have basic preparations in your house ready to go, is the fact that the characters decide to bug out for no particular reason. They're going to their parents' place, which they assume is outside the area of effect, which that's one of the interesting things about this movie, is the power goes out. Eventually the phone lines stop working as well, because they had landline phones, so you could actually use a phone without electricity, at least back then. Nowadays, I don't have a landline phone. Very few people do. So the fact of the power going out, if your internet's out or your cell phone dies, you're not going to have coverage. Or if the grid gets overwhelmed for some reason, or the local towers all lose power in a massive power outage, you won't even know how widespread this thing is. They don't know if it's the whole country. They don't know if it's their county. They have no idea what's going on. So they decide to go to, I think, the husband's parents' place, which is, you know, a couple hours away or whatever, assuming that it might be outside the area of effect. And they leave without having enough, knowing they don't have enough gas to get there. They have like they have what's in the car, a little bit of extra gas in a can that they siphoned out of their other vehicles, and then they say we're gonna need 7 gallons more before we get there. Absolutely terrible idea. They just get nervous because of the guy breaking in, and a neighbor ends up shooting them, so the situation is tense in their neighborhood, and they decide to leave, which is absolutely terrible idea just in general. Abysmal idea when you know you don't have the resources to get as far as you're going to go. So that is the biggest mistake they make in this movie, and it ends very poorly for them because, as you would suspect, they actually don't end up running out of gas because they end up encountering problems before that with other people who are also on edge and everything like that. So that's just a terrible idea. If they had had even a basic level of preparations, firearms or other home defense, and knowledge and willingness to use them, they wouldn't have been as fearful. They would have had food and probably even a little bit of gas, because as I've mentioned before in my videos, having a simple couple 5-gallon gas cans around, that will get you to where you're going in most situations. Certainly nowadays, they were talking about their vehicle having 20 miles to the gallon. Most modern vehicles have significantly more than that. And if you use basic hypermiling techniques, like not driving over 50 miles an hour, not using the air conditioner, you can, and braking as little as possible and things like that, you can actually push that up well beyond that, 10, 15, 20% or more in most situations if there's not heavy traffic. So having the things there, like I said, would have been a very short movie. So I won't get into all the things that happen in the end of the movie because they're mostly related to non-prepping type situations, how to deal with people, and I want to save a little bit for you guys to watch, and you can discuss it in the comments if you want. But the last thing I'm going to mention, which was very significant, was they're all hanging out with their neighbors in somebody's house during this power outage, and people start talking about, oh, this guy's got a generator, you're not going to help me, and start arguing over who should be supplying what and if they're going to try and use it if they need it and all this other stuff. So you definitely don't want people to know what kind of stuff you have unless you're absolutely certain they're on board. It's good to have a friendly rapport with your neighbors in terms of you know who they are, they know who you are, because they're a lot less likely to do anything if they feel like you're friends with them. But that does not mean that you want to bring them in on everything that you're doing or are capable of or storing unless you're absolutely sure they're going to be trustworthy, not even just in general, but in a stressful situation where they feel like themselves and their families are in danger, because they may resort to all sorts of crazy shit, taking your stuff. And so unless you have a specific reason to be with those people, I wouldn't even be around them in a stressful situation like that unless you have very good reason. Simply chumming it up because you're bored is probably not a good enough reason. So those are my thoughts on the movie Trigger Point. Check it out on Netflix if you guys want. Let me know what you think, and if you learned anything else from that movie by watching it, and what other prepper kind of survival points you can learn from that. You can mention that in the comments below. And I will be doing this with more movies in the future, so if you have some movies that you would recommend, like I said, I'd like to lean more towards real world stuff like that. Something like Mad Max, while entertaining, there's not a whole lot of real world like preparedness and survival tips to be learned from a movie like that versus a movie like this. So let me know what you guys think. Talk to you later. Thanks for watching.